Today's video is sponsored by the absolute legends at Squarespace. We've got 20 drivers who rock up week in, week out for 10 teams to race Formula One cars. Now, it's not a spec series, never has been. So a big part of why Mercedes are there and then like Williams and Haas are down here is the fact that the cars, the budgets, massive difference in resource being put into creating the fastest car possible. But what about the drivers? How much of that gap is down to one driver being a better driver than another driver? That's the question I'm trying to answer today. It's going to be impossible to say for sure, of course, because again, it's not a spec series, it's not an absolute level playing field, but there's a bunch of factors that I think, taken into account, we can come to some kind of conclusion. Are we truly seeing the cream of the crop in Formula One cars? Look, I honestly believe if motorsport was as accessible as a sport like football, where anyone can just go outside and pick up a ball. If anyone could just go outside and pick up a go-kart for cheap as chips and drive it and tracks are everywhere, I reckon 80% of the F1 grid, at least, would be different. There must be so much good promising talent that never gets the opportunity to fulfill itself, falls by the wayside because of money. Because people can't afford karting, let alone formula racing. If that financial barrier didn't exist, the sport would be so much more competitive than it is at the moment. All the seats, not just in Formula 1, Formula 2, Formula 3, every seat would be filled with the most talented, promising individuals, not the most financially privileged ones. Motorsport is ludicrously expensive across the board. It's not necessarily pay to win, but it is most certainly pay to compete. Even drivers we don't consider as pay drivers at some stage have had to rely on a big bit of wealth coming from either family, a brand sponsorship, or a team supporting them as a young driver to get them to where they are. I mean, you look at Formula 2, Callum Ilott came second last year in F2, could have won it, incredibly talented young man, doesn't have a seat in F2, yet Alessio De Lada does. Watch John Warren's video, link above, to see why that's such a shambles. But again, if F1 was a spec series, you would see these drivers who don't have the talent get fully exposed. But it's not. But what if it was? An F1 spec series kind of already exists, and it is called F1 Esports. Now look, I'm sure some of you will be quick to dismiss esports from the conversation. It's not real racing, blah, 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 blah. Regardless of whether or not you think it's valid as a sport, that's not the point. In this instance, it is 100% undoubtedly relevant. F1 Esports is an F1 spec series. All of the cars' performance is identical. They can change the setups, of course, just like in any other spec series. But the cars, the engine, the output, the aero, all of that is identical. So therefore, the 20 individuals who make the cut, get through qualifiers, get the chance to be swooped up by a team, they are all there firmly on merit. Of course, there will be some who maybe got a bit unlucky or maybe just got overlooked by a team, of course, but again, that's the case of any sport. It is a fact that the 20 drivers competing are 20 of the most talented in the world at that discipline. It is a true meritocracy, something that can't be said for the real thing. And why don't pay drivers exist in F1 Esports? Because it's so much more accessible. Of course, a wheel, a next-gen console, F1 2020, those things, they cost quite a bit of money. Okay, not all households have that money to throw about. When I was a kid, I just played on pad. But compared to a career in motorsport, where even karting can cost 6 figures a year, it's not even close. All right, now it's time for your favorite part of the video. I know it is. It's ad break time. Thank you, Squarespace, for supporting me and sponsoring today's video. So, are you looking to set up an online website, store, blog, portfolio maybe? Big or small, doesn't matter. Squarespace is the perfect all-in-one platform to build yourself your own little online home. There's no need to go to some sus-looking website to try and buy a domain. That's all on Squarespace. There's no need for any coding knowledge, which coding is literally my worst nightmare. I hate it. You can code if you really want to, but you don't need any of that knowledge to create something that looks banging. So why don't you go to squarespace.com for a completely free trial, take your time, create something you're happy with, and then use the code TOMMOF1 or give the link in the top line of the description a tap to bag yourself 10% off your first website or domain. Cheers, Squarespace. Now back to you, long sleeve buttoned up shirt, Tommo. So let's look at the Austrian Grand Prix as an example, because a quick quali lap is just over a minute, and it was raced in by the Esports guys and the Real, guys. Right, so we're looking at Q1, all 20 cars out on track. Jarno Opmeer, unsurprisingly, finished P1 with a 102.216. And then in P20 was Matthias Collegon with a 102.461. That's 0.245 seconds, less than a quarter of a second, splitting the entire field. In the real race, however, the gap between P1, Bottas, and P20, Latifi, was 1.646 seconds, almost 7 times bigger. Now, of course, the Mercedes is a much better car than the Williams. They're not in equal machinery like in the game, and that accounts for a significant part of why that gap is 1.6 seconds. But then you look at the gap between Nicholas and his teammate George, who was nowhere near the top and still went out in Q1. That gap was 0.59 seconds. In identical machinery, that gap itself is still well over double the gap between the entire F1 Esports field. So the conclusion I'm taking from this is that F1 Esports is an example of how competitive F1 could be if it was a spec series and if it was way more accessible. Unfortunately, it's neither of those things. But basically, best case scenario, Austria is a 1 minute lap. It's a quarter of a second gap. So I'm saying that is the minimum amount of time you could possibly expect the gap to be between top and bottom. I did look at some other F1 Esports qualifying, and that gap, so on a longer track, that gap would be bigger, but it all stayed pretty relative, the gap between absolute top and absolute bottom. Well, who is the fastest? Who are we talking about? Who's the fastest and who's the slowest? Because we have to know who we're talking about in order to try and think about what that gap could be. Now, look, I'm genuinely not trying to pander here at all, but I do agree with the consensus, which seems to be that Lewis and Max, in terms of outright pace and speed, are the two fastest. And then in terms of slowest, again, consensus seems to be Latifi and Mazepin, and I'm kind of inclined to agree. They're the two drivers we've kind of seen the least from. Both undoubtedly have talent. Both have won races in Formula 2. You don't do that if you don't have talent. But it is also unquestionable the fact that both of them have parents who own or part own or have some kind of deal with their team. We know they wouldn't have their seats if it was a true meritocracy. That's just the truth. I've been genuinely wrong about Nicholas in the past. He seems like such a sound bloke, such a nice geezer. But it's the truth. But also, like I said earlier, if it was a true meritocracy, they wouldn't be the only ones. I think 80% of the grid would probably be different. So what do you lot think? Because like I like to do sometimes, and this is a good opportunity to plug my Twitter, go follow me at @TomMcCluskey_. I put the question out to see what you lot think. So here is the tweet. Picture the scene. Spa-Francorchamps. All 20 F1 drivers in identical machinery that's to current F1 specs. So a 1:43-ish lap time in qualifying. All given equal practice time to get comfortable with the car to their ideal setup, of course. What is the time gap between the fastest and slowest driver over one lap? 4 responses here covered the range pretty well. So you got 0.1 to 0.3 seconds, 0.4 to 0.6, 0.7 to 0.9 seconds, and then over a second. Not many of you went for 0.1 to 0.3, but the vote was pretty evenly spread, I'd say, between 0.4 and over a second. Although what's funny is that most of the comments were people saying it would be well over a second, Hamilton would smash Latifi. Turns out the loudest people aren't always the biggest proportion, which is just Twitter in a nutshell, isn't it? And actually from this comment section, the kind of idea and the F1 Esports angle on this video I took was from Simon Weigang, who is one of the 20 aliens who is the quickest in the world at F1 2020, because he commented the following. Well, the cars in esports are equal and everything above 0.2 is considered pretty arse-whipping. Good point, Simon. Well made. So where does this leave us? Because I've talked a lot, but have I really said much? Look, I've tried to give this some real thought, and I think that if you had an in real life F1 spec series around a 1:43-ish lap like Spa, we'd be looking at a bottom to top gap of between 0.7 and 0.9 seconds. I've changed my mind from the 0.4 to 0.6 I originally put. When you extrapolate that quarter of a second gap I was talking about at Austria between the F1 Esports lot, which again is as competitive as F1 could possibly be, then you're only talking 0.4 seconds around a lap like Spa. So why have I put it higher? Well, firstly, as I've already explained more than enough, F1 is not a meritocracy. The 20 drivers in F1 are not the 20 most talented drivers in the world. Then there's something I haven't really touched on, which is the experience gap. Because again, F1 Esports, everyone is super young. They're all in the same kind of age bracket and they're all equally just putting all of their time into that game to get as good as they can be. There isn't a massive discrepancy in experience, but in F1, there is. You look at Lewis Hamilton and the wealth of experience he's built over the years, and then a rookie like Yuki Tsunoda coming in, who has very, very little experience. He was racing F3 in 2019. That has to count for something in a qualifying lap time. And then finally, one other point. I think law of diminishing returns is a thing. The faster you get, the smaller those time saves become. But then you look at people like, again, Mazepin and Latifi. They're not in the top 20. They're maybe top 100 still, towards the bottom of that, maybe. Which then probably means that that gap is a little bit bigger than it is, again, at the very top. All that together, I'm saying 0.7 to 0.9. But who bloody knows? Waffle complete, we're done. You're very welcome. Look, I find this stuff really kind of interesting. The videos like this, I really enjoy making. So if you like it as well, then make sure you hit the like button and subscribe. I'm really sorry if you didn't. I would genuinely love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. I'd love to see what comment gets the most upvotes in terms of what is the most popular opinion on this maybe. Do you think I was about right? Do you think I'm miles off one way or the other? Did I miss any points? Did I get anything wrong? Do you think I'm a twat? Like, go at it. Thank you very much as ever again for watching. My name is Tommo. This is no longer the Tommo F1 YouTube channel, but we all know why you're here. Thanks again. Have a good one. Ta-da.